This video takes a look at the Samsung C27F591FD, also referred to as simply the F as a suffix. Various regional suffixes also apply. The monitor, as you'll notice when you first turn it on, has a very thin border, so it's good for a multi-display setup. Another aspect which you're bound to notice, and is one of the key sort of marketing elements for this monitor, is the fact that it's curved. It has a much steeper curve than the previous year's models, the E-series models. I barely noticed the curve on the E-series models, but on this model I do notice the curve. And I don't say that in a bad way, it's still quite subtle in my opinion, but again, it's because it's not massively obvious, I find it quite natural. I find it quite a natural experience using the monitor, and I've adapted to the curve quite quickly, which is good. Before getting too deep into the review, I'd like to point a couple of things out. Firstly, the video in no way reflects what you'll actually see firsthand when using this monitor. It reflects your own monitor that you're using to view the video, and also this camera used to record the video. The other thing is, this is designed to complement the written review. I'll be referring to the written review throughout. It's not going to be as detailed or thorough, and I highly recommend reading the written review as well, and there's a link to that in the comments section of this video. Now, I'm going to just show you a few things about the sort of external appearance of the monitor, the aesthetics if you like. The first thing is the stand base. It's something some people found a bit strange. It's sort of a dish, a silver matte plastic dish. It does mean that the monitor takes up a fair bit of depth on the desk. I mean, I've used plenty of monitors which are deeper, but if you look, it does extend sort of quite far back between there and there. I think there are measurements in the written review, I can't remember them off the top of my head. And it's a bit of a strange sort of design, but I thought maybe you could use it to, put your phone down when you're not using it. Make use of that dish. There's no QI charger or anything like that. This rubbish smartphone doesn't have wireless charging anyway, but it seems like a nice feature they could have just added with the design, but they didn't. The bottom lip, the bottom bezel, is also a matte plastic silver. The side of the monitor also has matte plastic silver, and you can see from the side it's pretty thin. You can see the curvature again, and actually the curvature of the screen is, I think in some of the marketing materials, and probably on this video, especially from this kind of angle, it actually looks like more of a feature than it actually is, the curve. When you're actually sitting down using this monitor, and I don't know how this is going to come across in the video, the curve's actually quite subtle, which, as I've said, I feel is a good thing. I'll talk a bit more about that later. The other aspect, I'm not going to go through the menu system because I've already gone through that in a separate video, but it is controlled by a joystick here at the back of the monitor, which I quite like. And speaking of the rear of the monitor, I'm just going to show you a photograph of that. I'm being a bit lazy here. I can't be bothered to turn the monitor off, unplug my PC, clear my desk, and show you the rear of the monitor in person, and I don't see the point since I've taken this photo earlier anyway. So you can see the joystick there, which I'd mentioned before. The stand is fixed. You can tilt the screen slightly forwards and backwards, but that's the only ergonomic flexibility you get. There are no VESA holes, which is something of a standard for Samsung monitors not to have them of this kind of design. So I know, that'll be something that some users will find a bit annoying. But the fairly similar Samsung C27F591FD, that does have VESA holes. It doesn't have the same sort of colour gamut as this monitor. We've got some news articles. I haven't reviewed that one yet, but I mean, that's an option that you might consider if you do want the VESA holes. And then there are the ports here. There's DisplayPort 1.2a, which supports FreeSync. HDMI 1.4a, which also supports FreeSync. There is a VGA input, which is just there for compatibility purposes. I'm sure many of you will be quite surprised to see an old analog connection still found on monitors these days. And there is a 3.5mm audio input and headphone jack, or audio output. And then there is a DC power connector, which means that the monitor has an external power brick. It doesn't have an internal power converter. And there's a little label there with some information about the model on it. And there's also a K slot, Kensington lock slot, for security purposes there. That's about all there is to it. The rest of the rear of the monitor is basically just a glossy white. So back to the front of the monitor, it also has some integrated speakers. I'm not sure if I'll be able to show you these. You can see the grille. It's they're stereo speakers. There's one there, one there. Off the top of my head, I believe they're 5 watts. Fairly decent. They give a reasonable sound output. They're not amazing, but they're better than quite a lot of integrated speakers, and especially when you use the music mode in the OSD, it has a fairly rich quality to the audio, so they're definitely usable. So for the rest of the video, I think it will be appropriate for me to show this side by side with another monitor, just so I can give you a bit of a comparison. I now have the monitor side by side with a Samsung S24E390HL, and that is a Samsung PLS, plain-to-line switching model, an AD PLS, advanced plain-to-line switching. That's Samsung's version of IPS. It's characteristically extremely similar. It can't be called IPS because that's a trademark of LG Display. The Samsung CF591 here, that uses a vertical alignment panel, and there are some differences to be aware of. Again, you're not going to be able to pick these up. One may look more vibrant to you on the video, but it may not reflect what I'm seeing here. Well, in fact, it will not reflect what I'm seeing here, so I'm just going to have to talk through some of the differences. Now, one thing that the strong contrast really shows nicely on this monitor, and I can see the difference just looking at them side by side here, is that the black of the butterfly's wings and the white spots, the contrast really sort of helps those white spots stand out. They really sort of pop out. And the orange and yellow bits of the wings as well, they stand out really nicely against the black. On this monitor, not bad. It actually has reasonable contrast, especially for an IPS type panel. And the room is not, particularly dark. This becomes even more obvious when the room is a bit darker, but you can definitely see a difference in that respect. Another difference between these monitors, and something that really sort of distinguishes this Samsung from most Full HD models on the market, is that it has a colour gamut that extends a bit beyond sRGB. It's not a wide gamut model in the traditional sense. It doesn't support Adobe RGB or any extended colour space like that, but it does have a pretty generous colour gamut, and that gives the image a bit of extra vibrancy. So for example, I can see that the oranges of the butterfly's wings there, and to some extent the green in the background, it's just a bit more vibrant. This isn't designed for necessarily accurate colour output, but that isn't to say that it's not given the sort of overblown, oversaturated look that a wide gamut monitor displaying sRGB content gives. It just gives it a bit of extra vividness, which I think works really well for entertainment purposes. I'm just going to talk about another aspect, which is something that's important to be aware of, the difference between the VA and IPS type panels, and that is colour consistency. Now, IPS type panels, they're very good as far as colour consistency goes, and that is to say that a shade that's displayed in the centre of the screen looks pretty similar no matter where on the screen it's displayed. So if it's on the edges, it'll look quite similar. And I've got the Lagom website's viewing angles test up at the moment, And again, you're not going to be able to see it quite representative on the video of what I'm actually seeing, but hopefully I'll be able to go through a couple of things, talk you through a couple of things of what I'm observing here. So on the IPS type panel, everything's a very blended grey on the Lagom test and that the text test, and that indicates that the gamma curve has a low viewing angle dependency, as you'd expect from an IPS type panel. On this, being a VA panel, the viewing angles aren't as good. The gamma curve is affected by the viewing angles a bit more. So it does look largely blended grey, but you can actually see some red towards the flanks of the screen and the bottom. And that's sort of something that you'd ideally not see. This is going to look completely bizarre on the video, but I'm just going to have to talk you through this. This is a purple block which looks a pretty solid sort of lilac colour on this monitor, and it probably looks some bizarre blue on the video, but never mind. On this monitor you might be able to just make out that again the flanks and the bottom of the screen have a bit of a sort of pink tint to them compared to the top, which is a more sort of similar colour to that. Again, for the red block, it's actually a bit better. It's fairly consistent even on the VA panel, but again it's got a little bit of a pink tint. So I mean, I'm not going to go through all of this in too much detail. I'm just trying to point out that you know, if you're looking to use these monitors for colour critical work, then IPS type displays do still have an advantage. But actually being a recent VA panel, and also the fact it's curved, does seem to actually make the viewing angles, or at least the sort of the colour shift from a normal viewing position, really quite good on this Samsung. It's something that's been improved with recent VA panels. I've tested a few BenQ AMVA Plus panels, as they're called, and that brought about some improvements in viewing angle performance. And this seems, if anything, a step beyond even that in terms of colour consistency. And what that means in the real world is that colours appear richer. They don't lose as much saturation at the bottom and the sides of the screen as they would on older VA models, especially considering the size. Another sort of issue to be aware of, or something that people are bound to point out with this model, it's a full HD model, same as this one, but it's 27 inches. And you hear a lot of frankly bizarre comments about how the resolution just looks awful on a 27 inch screen, and how it's just not suitable at all. Well, yes, it's true that it's a fairly low resolution. The pixel density is not great by modern standards. You know, you can get 2560 by 1440, 3840 by 2160, so WQHD and UHD 4K resolutions for monitors of this size these days, and this is pretty much the lower end of what you'd expect. But if you actually compare it to this, which is a 23.6 inch screen, the difference isn't huge. You know, I think people make quite exaggerated claims, so I wouldn't worry too much about this. It doesn't have pixels that are the size of golf balls. Everything does not look pixelated. You know, generally the image looks quite similar from a normal viewing distance to what it does on a 24 or so inch screen that's also full HD. So I'm not going to say too much more about that. I'm just going to fire up a game so I can talk a bit more about the sort of colour performance of the this Samsung, and also the contrast and various other observations in the game. So I've just opened up Dirt Rally, and it's a very dark, a dark map. I've also cut out the light to the room as much as I can. You know, I've closed the curtains basically. So I'll talk a bit about the contrast performance, and again, you won't be able to necessarily see a very good comparison. I mean, it's not ideal. Ideally, I'd be doing this in a dark room as well, but you know, the video is not going to show you a particularly good comparison, but I will be able to talk about a few things. And even in this little sort of intro screen here, I can see a lot more detail on this, and you can probably see a bit of glow. It does have something you might dub VA glow, so towards the bottom there is, from a normal viewing position, a little bit of sort of glow, but compared to this, it's, you know, it's a lot more subdued. You know, this just has a completely flooded look there. It completely kills the details. It does up there as well, up there. That's IPS glow, or more correctly PLS glow on that monitor. So the level of detail you get in dark scenes in games, movies, whatever, is much better on the VA model. There's a definite strength of the CF591. One of the reasons I've actually opened up Dirt Rally rather than, you know, it's not my favourite game. I'm not actually very good at it at all, to be honest, but it's just an easy game to play whilst also holding a camera and talking about it. So another aspect of the strong contrast of the Samsung is that you can see a really nice distinction between the light shades and dark shades. Of course, that's by definition what contrast is. You know, the contrast's not phenomenal. This isn't an OLED or QLED display or anything like that. It's still an LCD. It has a contrast ratio that I've measured to be round about the specified 3000 to 1. This screen has a contrast ratio that's about 1/3 of that. So you can see a difference. And you know, the lights on this car stand out really beautifully well against the darker background on this game, which is very nice. And of course, if I was playing something like Battlefield, you'd see that the explosions would stand out really nicely as well, and that kind of thing. So it helps build a nice atmosphere, especially given the sort of the depth of the darkness in the game as well, compared to the more flooded look that the IPS. Now, I don't have a TN model up at the moment. I do have a couple down there. I have been using them recently, but they're out of action, as you can see. But when it comes to displaying dark content and just considering contrast in general, TN models, you might consider they are some way between the IPS and the VA, but really they're sort of in a class of their own. They're a bit different. The gamma handling, the viewing angles are quite poor on TN. They're a lot poorer than IPS, poorer than VA as well. And what you tend to get, and in fact what you do get, is that the gamma is higher at the top and lower at the bottom of the screen. What that means is, if you look at dark content at the top, it looks darker, as in, you know, you don't get distinct details like I can see on this model. It looks sort of a bit more like the glowy areas of this, but throughout the screen, even in the central bits towards the top. And you get more detail revealed further down the screen, and actually towards the bottom of the screen, if you've calibrated the monitor to 2.2 gamma or whatever you've set in the middle, the bottom actually has a lower gamma, which means that some unintended details, extra details, are revealed to you. Now, I mean, as I've mentioned, the gamma performance isn't perfect on the VA panels, but the overall atmosphere, it's much better than you get on IPS or TN, basically. Now, I'm not going to be able to go through this on the video again, because I'm not really able to show you exactly what I can see, but vertical alignment panels do have something called black crush, which is again related to the gamma behaviour. So if you look at especially the central region of the screen directly in front, then there is less detail than if you look at it from an angle. Now, or if you actually just look at the extreme sort of edges from directly in front. Now, it's actually quite low. The black crush is not really a big issue at all on this monitor. It's probably the lowest I've seen on a vertical alignment panel, whether that's because of the panel itself is quite good in that respect. The curve maybe has an influence as well. So I really wouldn't worry about it, and I don't really think that it saps enough detail to be really considered a big issue, and especially not when you compare it to something like IPS glow. It's really the lesser of any evils, really. So I'm going to change to a more colourful rally track now, so I can talk a bit about the colours and won't bore you to death too much more about the contrast. So now I'm starting up a more colourful map in the daytime. and this is going to allow me to talk a bit about colour. Again, you're not going to be able to see a good comparison by looking at the video in terms of what I can actually see or what you'd see firsthand, but I'm not really here to show you exactly how things look, but I will talk about how things look. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, the colour gamut of this screen is quite generous. So it does give a vibrant look to colours. As I've also mentioned, the viewing angles, they're really quite good for vertical alignment of this size, so you don't lose as much saturation on the outside and at the bottom as you'd usually see. You know, there is a little bit of loss of saturation, so if I look at some of the deeper greens, they're a bit deeper in the centre than they are towards the edges of the screen, but I mean, it's not as pronounced as you'd usually see on a VA panel, and overall the image looks very rich. It does look vibrant, but it still looks quite accurately, faithfully represented, which is good. And I've also picked this vehicle here because it just shows how sort of contrast and colours go together in ways. So these bright blues, bright oranges stand out really nicely against the dark black because of the contrast of the monitor being so strong, aided by the colour gamut as well and the panel type. Now, something I didn't actually mention earlier is that the screen surface of this monitor is light matte. It has a very low graininess to it, if you want to use that term. It has a low haze value and has a smooth surface texture. Now, if you're familiar with this Samsung, I actually quite like the surface on this Samsung. It's okay, it's medium matte or relatively light, I think I referred to it in the review. It has a fairly smooth surface texture, but there is still a bit of graininess when you look at lighter colours such as the sky. On this monitor, it's not a glossy monitor and it's not as light as some matte surfaces I've seen, but it's really pretty good. It's I'm quite sensitive to strong matte screen surfaces, grainy matte screen surfaces. I really dislike them a lot, so I'm quite comfortable with the sort of level that's been achieved on this one. So yes, the variety of shades, because the colour consistency is quite good, is very good. I can see a lot of distinct different green shades, brown shades. It all looks pretty natural. It's just a little bit of weakening saturation, as I've mentioned, in places. So, I mean, as far as colours go, there's not too much to really complain about. As those who've done a bit of background reading or just understand a little bit more about the panel types themselves, vertical alignment panels are the weakest of the main LCD panel types in terms of responsiveness. You might not see that if you look at specifications. This has a specified 4 millisecond grey to grey response time. This has 5 milliseconds. But you have to look beyond those values. They're shall we say, cherry-picked values. This monitor certainly does not run all of its pixel transitions at 4 milliseconds, nor does this one run all of its at 5 milliseconds. There's a lot of variation in the speed, especially on VA panels, depending on the shades involved in the transition. Now, this can be shown quite nicely on Test UFO, which is a motion test for ghosting, which I'm using at the moment. This is explained in a lot of detail in the written review, and you're not going to be able to see exactly what I see on the camera again, but I will at least be able to explain a few things. Firstly, this is it's a 72 Hz monitor, 60 Hz monitor. It's running at 72 Hz at the moment, and a lot of the motion blur you'll see when you're playing a game or if you're observing moving content such as these UFOs on the screen, a lot of that is attributed to eye movement or camera movement. Now, you're not going to be able to see this on the video because this isn't pursuit photography. Again, you have to refer to the written review for more about that. But what that means is, even if this had a response time that's a fraction of what it actually has. You know, even if it had a theoretical, let's say, 0.1 millisecond response times on all transitions, you'd still see a certain amount of blur because it's a sample and hold display at 72 Hz. I've got an article on the website which explores that in a lot of detail, but there's a sort of brief summary of that in the review, which I definitely recommend reading, because I'm not going to bore you to death with too much detail about that now. But the other element of perceived blur comes from the pixel response, the pixel response times. This monitor is quite good as far as 60 to 72 Hz monitors go. You know, the pixel responses are generally fast enough so that you can't really see extra trailing behind the object. Lots of what you see is just down to your eye movement. On this, again, it's mostly down to the eye movement, but there's a definite trail behind the object as well. And the extent of that trailing depends on the colours or the shades involved in the transition, or the depth of shades, the grey level. So at the bottom, it has a lighter background, the middle is a medium background, and the top is a darker cyan background. And VA panels almost always have relative weaknesses when they have dark shades involved in the transitions. So the top row there, you might even be able to see on the video there's a fairly bold black trail behind the UFO. There, the mid cyans, pixel responses are a bit faster, trailing's a bit smaller. The light cyan background, again the trailing's reduced further. Now, it's, as far as VA panels go, I'd say this is one of the better ones I've used. Most of the pixel transitions are fast enough to give, you know, only a little bit of extra trailing, you know, a little bit of trailing, a little bit of extra blur on top of what you'd ideally see. But there definitely are some weaknesses where the darker trailing, the darker shades are involved. But it's not like some of the older VA models I've tested where you get a sort of smoky, obvious smear behind the movement, which makes playing games quite a dizzying, distracting experience. It's not that bad, but you know, there are some imperfections, especially when you compare it to faster panel types. So the written review explores that in quite a lot of detail. I consider this to be a decent enough monitor if you're happy with 60 to 72 Hz for gaming. I should also mention it does have FreeSync, and I do apologise, by the way, if anyone, I know some people don't like snakes, so I'm sorry that my background's just changed to snakes, but this does actually, probably one of my favourite backgrounds to look at on VA models, because that black, in contrast to the green of the snake, is quite brilliant, especially compared to that. But anyway, that's not what I was going to talk about. I'll change the background just in case, so hopefully no one doesn't like big cats. There you go. Now, this monitor has FreeSync. This monitor does not have FreeSync, and if you have the Ultimate engine enabled in the OSD, which is explored in the review and the OSD video, the written review, then you have a variable refresh rate range of between 48 Hz and 72 Hz. This monitor has a fixed refresh rate of whatever you set it to, so now, for example, it's 72 Hz. What would happen is, if you're observing a game and it drops below 72 Hz, 72 frames a second, you'd get stuttering if you have VSync enabled, or you'd get tearing if you have VSync disabled. And even if you can't necessarily see the tear lines, because not everyone actually sees that, people can often notice a sort of juddering effect as the different sections of the screen are at different parts of the refresh cycle. With FreeSync you don't get any of that. You get the refresh rate dynamically adjusts to the frame rate of the content, so it's free from that sort of tearing, juddering or stuttering. The system I'm using at the moment has a Radeon 290 FreeSync compatible GPU. That's moderately powerful. There are definitely more powerful solutions available today, and there are less powerful solutions, but this is considered sort of middle ground at the moment to me, and even though it's only Full HD, 72Hz max, there are still some scenarios where my GPU will struggle. And it's almost inevitable in modern titles, especially if you've got the detail settings up a bit, that you will get dips below the sort of 72Hz ceiling, 72 frames a second. And on this monitor, you've either just got to put up with them, put up with the tearing and the stuttering or whatever, or you just have to lower the settings so that you can maintain a consistent 72 frames a second. On this monitor, you can play your titles like Tom Clancy's The Division, Grand Theft Auto 5 with pretty high detail settings, and you don't have to worry so much about those dips. If the dips are too profound, for example, you're getting maybe 50 frames a second or lower, you can definitely notice a difference in terms of how responsive the monitor feels and the level of perceived blur, because the frame rate itself is lower. And even with FreeSync, lower frame rates are still lower frame rates. So having FreeSync, or adaptive sync as it's called on the monitor itself, is helpful when the frame rate drops just a little bit below the maximum supported by the monitor. So that pretty much wraps up the video review. I'm just going to turn on the light so you can admire the monitor itself a bit more. And I'm going to put this one away and then I'll conclude the review. So now I've put a little bit of light and a bit of desk space back, I'll just wrap the review up. So the monitor, as far as Full HD monitors go, I think it's pretty capable. It's a good monitor for sort of entertainment use, general purpose use. It's not the best for colour accuracy. If you're doing colour critical work, you can definitely do some, especially if you're calibrating the monitor with a colorimeter, but just be aware that the panel type does have limitations, and really you're wanting an IPS type panel if you're into that kind of thing quite heavily. But for everything else, I think this monitor is pretty nice. The contrast performance is good, the resolution is fairly GPU friendly. It also has the benefit of AMD FreeSync support if you're an AMD GPU user with a compatible GPU, and it goes up to 72Hz very comfortably even if you've got an NVIDIA GPU, which is quite nice. The contrast is very strong, the colour gamut is generous, so it gives a nice vibrant image, it gives a good rich look to the image with plenty of pop. The screen surface is quite agreeable as well, so it does have a lot going for it. I think in terms of its style, Samsung are often quite bold with their styling. It's a bit of a Marmite thing. That's a British spread which some people hate and some people love. So I think the thin bezels, people are bound to like them. This bit of the stand I'm not so sure about though. Anyway, it's looks quite decent. And of course the curve, which is one of the major selling points of the monitor. I think they've done quite well with that because it's actually noticeable, unlike with the older 27-inch curved monitors. But it isn't so noticeable that it sort of distorts the image. If you're doing design work or something like that, yeah, you probably want a straight monitor, to be fair. But for everything else, I think this the curve is something that you'll find quite natural and you'll be able to adapt to quite nicely. As with all VA panels, it does have weaknesses in terms of pixel response times, especially where dark elements are involved, but it's actually quite good. It's one of the faster VA models I've used. It's something that's quite subjective. Some people might find it bothersome, other people won't. They won't even notice that there's a problem. It gives a fairly decent performance. There's also a bit of overshoot, but again, that's something that most people, I'd imagine, aren't actually going to notice. Input lag is also pretty low. It's the main component of that, which people should be interested in. Signal delay is actually very low. It's mainly the pixel responses which drag the input lag figures up a bit. I hope you've enjoyed the review. I know I haven't given you lots of sort of gaming footage, and I wasn't showing you sort of FreeSync in action or anything like that. It's simply because I'm a firm believer that that kind of thing you have to see firsthand, or you have to hear about or read about. It's just not something that you can show with a video. The written review, which is linked to in the description of the video, is well worth a look if you're interested in purchasing this monitor, or if you're just interested in learning a bit more about this monitor. If you are going to purchase the monitor, be sure to use the link at the bottom of the written review, which helps support the work that we do. And you know, if you guys like the video, do let me know. If you didn't like it, also let me know. It's something that's quite new to me on this channel. It's not something I'm used to doing really, so it's just something I'm just testing the water with at the moment.